Welcome to this week's Bible reading and my reflections. This week's Bible reading is from Luke's Gospel, chapter 12, and I'm going to be reading from verse 23 to 40. Then Jesus said to his disciples, "Therefore I tell you, do not worry about your life, what you will eat, or about your body, what you will wear. Life is more than food, and the body more than clothes. Consider the ravens. They do not sow or reap. They have no storeroom or barn, yet God feeds them. And how much more valuable you are than birds. Who of you, by worrying, can add a single hour to his life? Since you cannot do this very little thing, why do you worry about the rest? Consider how the lilies grow. They do not labor or spin. Yet I tell you, not even Solomon in all his splendor was dressed like one of these. If that is how God clothes the grass of the field, which is here today and tomorrow is thrown into the fire, how much more will he clothe you, O you of little faith? And do not set your hearts on what you will eat or drink. Do not worry about it. For the pagan world runs after all such things, and your Father knows that you need them. But seek his kingdom, and these things will be given to you as well. Do not be afraid, little flock, for your Father has been pleased to give you the kingdom. Sell your possessions and give to the poor. Provide purses for yourselves that will not wear out, a treasure in heaven that will not be exhausted, where no thief comes near and no moth destroys. But where your treasure is, there your heart will be also. Be dressed ready for service and keep your lamps burning, like men waiting for their master to return from a wedding banquet, so that when he comes and knocks, they can immediately open the door for him. It will be good for those servants whose master finds them watching when he comes. I tell you the truth, he will dress himself to serve, will have them recline at the table, and will come and wait on them. It will be good for those servants whose master finds them ready, even if he comes in the second or third watch of the night. But understand this, if the owner of the house had known at what hour the thief was coming, he would not have let his house be broken into. You also must be ready, because the Son of Man will come at an hour when you do not expect him." I wonder how you've been going with living the life in all its fullness that Jesus came to give to us. Jesus said in John's Gospel, chapter 10, verse 10, "I have come so that people may have life and have it to the full." In the passage in John's Gospel, Jesus contrasts himself with those who've come to steal and kill and destroy, like thieves who've got their eye on sheep that belong to others. In contrast, Jesus says he is the good shepherd. What do you picture life to the full looking like? Some Bible translations use the English words abundant life or life in its abundance. As you review the last day, the last few days, you might think about what has happened to you that has gone well, what has brought you joy. And you might also remember the things that you've struggled with, the difficulties that you've had to face. Perhaps we imagine that for us to live life to the full, everything has to have gone perfectly. But I don't think that is why Jesus came. I don't think that is his gift to us, because I don't hear Jesus speaking to his disciples about living a problem-free life. In fact, he says quite a lot about the difficulties his disciples will face. As I've been pondering the question of what life in all its fullness looks like, I'm thinking that it is a life of shalom, a life of right relationships, a life where love for God is at the center, and love for others, and a concern for ourselves as well. This is the life that Jesus lived. He is our example of life in all its fullness. that this is the life that will enable us to be the people that God created us to be. And being in right relationship with God and others comes through Jesus Christ. His coming to earth in human flesh has brought us shalom, brought us right relationship. Through Jesus's life, death, and resurrection, the barriers that existed between God and us have come down. Jesus has reconciled us, and relationships between us and our fellow human beings are being transformed as Jesus equips us to love and forgive. So I want to rephrase my question from have you been living a life in all its fullness to have you been loving God with your whole being, and have you been loving others in the same way as you have been attending to your own needs? There are, of course, certain seasons when we do need to focus on ourselves, when we're traveling a particularly difficult journey, when we just might not be able to focus on loving others. And I notice that on occasions, Jesus's prayers are about the situation that he is facing. But over the weeks, over the months, over the years, let's not have our focus purely on attending to our own needs. Let's not neglect loving God or loving others. Otherwise, we will miss out on living life to the full, the gift of Jesus to us. In last week's reading, we heard Jesus warning against all kinds of greed. Greed is about fulfilling our own needs. It stops us from loving others and probably stops us from loving God as well. It stops us from living life in all its fullness. I wonder how much of your week has been focused on fulfilling your own needs. Of course, we're all a work in progress. It's good to stop and take stock sometimes, though. This week, we hear from Jesus about something else that stops us from receiving his gift to us of life in all its fullness, and that's worry and fear. Now, if you're a person who suffers from worry or anxiety or fear, I don't think generally it's very helpful when people tell you not to worry. If it was that easy, most people would have just stopped. But of course, it's more difficult than that. It involves changing a mindset, and that takes time and effort. But because this is Jesus telling his followers not to worry or be afraid, I think we need to pay particular attention to what he says. He tells us that we can break the bonds of worry and fear and cultivate different thought patterns. And I want to share with you what I've noticed in his words. Firstly, we are to consider creation. We're to look beyond ourselves at the world which God has created. So in verse 24 of the chapter, he says, consider the ravens. I imagine that they are there for Jesus to point to, perhaps flying in the sky, or perhaps perched on a tree, or perhaps feeding on the ground. Have a look at them, Jesus says. And a bit later on in verse 27, consider the lilies. Look at God's handiwork. Take your focus away from yourself and what is causing you worry, and look out, look up, look at creation. Look out of the window, take a walk, look at the wildlife, look at the trees and plants, look at a wildlife program on TV. Be amazed by God's handiwork. Psychologists seem to be catching up with Jesus on the benefits of getting out into nature. There's a thing called Japanese forest bathing, quoting from an online article in National Geographic. In the 1990s, researchers began studying the psychological benefits of forest bathing, providing the science to support what we innately know: time spent in nature is good for us. For God's people, there's more to do when we look at the created world. We can start considering the creator, God. We start by considering what we can see with our physical eyes. We then move to considering what we see with our spiritual eyes, God. We think on what we discover or are reminded about God through looking at his creation. Jesus says of the ravens, God feeds them. How much more valuable you are than birds, valuable to God. And of the lilies, Jesus says, God clothes the grass of the field. How much more will God clothe you? Your Father knows that you need food and drink and clothes. So we do well to ponder on God and his love and care for us. We move from thinking about ourselves to looking at creation, to thinking about God, his care for us. And we try to change what is going on in our minds from worry about how our own needs are going to be met to seeking God's kingdom. So in verse 30 of this passage, seek God's kingdom, Jesus says, and these things will be given to you as well. It's one of the things that marks us out as God's people. Jesus says that the pagans are preoccupied by worrying about their material needs, what they're going to eat and drink. As God's people, we are to seek God's kingdom, and that is not a fruitless pursuit. Jesus tells us our Father in heaven has been pleased to give the kingdom to us. Seeking God's kingdom brings us back to the hallmarks of God's kingdom, loving God and loving others as ourselves. Jesus is teaching his disciples to shift their focus. Don't be dominated by your material needs, by your physical needs. Let's not be gripped by the fear of what some psychologists see as the root of all our fears, and that's death. Let's familiarize ourselves with what the Bible tells us about death, what Jesus' death and resurrection teach us about death. Let's familiarize ourselves with what Paul's letters teach us about death and resurrection. Let's talk about death and face it head on. Instead of focusing on our material needs or being worried about the inevitable, be rich towards God, Jesus teaches. Seek God's kingdom. Provide purses for yourselves that will not wear out, a treasure in heaven that will not be exhausted. Jesus then goes on to say more about what our focus is to be. It's not to be on ourselves. We're to be dressed, ready for service. We're to be people on the lookout, like servants waiting for our master to return from a wedding banquet. So in verse 37, Jesus says, it will be good for those servants whose master finds them watching when he comes. And then the next verse, it will be good for those servants whose master finds them ready, even if he comes in the middle of the night or towards daybreak. As Jesus says more, it becomes clear that we are to be watching and ready for the Son of Man, a title for Jesus. We might think that Jesus is telling his disciples to keep watch and be ready for when he returns and when the new heavens and earth come into being and God's kingdom comes in all its fullness. And Jesus might be teaching about this. Or it might be that this teaching is for those first disciples. They are to be watching and ready for when Jesus inaugurates the kingdom of God here on earth through his death and resurrection. Or it might be that Jesus is telling his disciples to keep watch and be ready for him working in our world at any time, in a season such as this, perhaps. As with most of Jesus's parables, there's not one correct interpretation. All three of our interpretations can be right at the same time. The central point, though, is the same. Our focus needs to be out there, looking out for Jesus. Fear and worry will make our focus turn in towards ourselves unless we take action. So I return to the previous points. Look out at creation, ponder the Creator, think about our Father in heaven's love and care for us, and as an act of will, decide to seek God's kingdom. In practical terms, it means meeting with people who are following Jesus's teachings, whose eyes are turned towards God, and who do meet week by week to worship with people who aren't self-absorbed, people in a church. It means meeting midweek with such people, perhaps joining a small group. We need to watch the conversations we're involved with. Are they helping us turn our focus towards God or not? Are they dragging our focus down and inwards instead of up and outwards? I have come, says Jesus, so that people may have life and have it to the full. That's a life not dominated by greed or by worry. It's a life of looking up and out, a life of love for God, a life of love for others, as well as taking care of ourselves. I end with a really surprising twist in Jesus's parable. We discover that when we turn our focus outwards, it is Jesus who takes care of us. Jesus's original audience would have been familiar with the world of servants and masters in a way we're not. Jesus talks about the servants doing what was expected of servants, waiting up until the master returns from a wedding banquet, no matter what time he decides to rock up. But now the twist. When the master returns and finds his servants up and watching for him, it is he, the master, who will dress himself to serve, will have them, the servants, recline at the table and will come and wait on them. The master will serve the servants. That's completely unexpected. Jesus will serve us. As Jesus says, it will be good for those servants whose master finds them ready, even he comes in the middle of the night or toward daybreak, because Jesus will serve us. Indeed, it will be good. Amen.